So thanks to the festival for inviting me to come and speak about open source design and the project that I worked on at Ushahidi. So just a little bit about me to begin with. So my name is Eriol. I call myself a humanitarian and a human rights-centered designer. So I really like to prioritize human rights within the design work that I do. It's a really new, evolving field of design. It's really exciting if you want to search for it online. I've been in the industry, commercial, proprietary, and now open source and nonprofit for 10 years, doing all different kinds of design. UI design, digital design, UX design. I just call myself a designer now. It's easier. So I've been in the humanitarian sector for 7 years, voluntarily doing community development work. But I've been in the open source space, working and operating and contributing for about 2 or 3 years now. So comparatively, I'm a baby in the open source software world, but I love it. It's so exciting. And I'm on the core team, so the organizing team, of an organization called opensourcedesign.net. So this is a community of designers interested in and advocating for design within open source projects and open source software. So when I first started working at Ushahidi, and Ushahidi are a non-profit organization based in Kenya, and they make mostly open source tools, but some closed source tools. And it's mainly tools around human rights and election violence in Kenya and crisis relief when there's natural disasters. They create a number of tools to help people in these situations. When I started working there and working with open source for the first time, I was going through this process of, working on issues like I had done in commercial corporate places and proprietary software places. But I was seeing every so often in development tickets, people that weren't working at the organization, that weren't part of the staff. And I was getting to know what it was to contribute to open source within the community. And I started to look at the design issues we had in our open source repo, because we put those there as well, where we want to be fully open with all the work that we're doing on the products at Ushahidi. And I was like, why aren't there contributors to the design issues? I was like, is this a problem? Does this not happen? So I asked a few people, and they were like, oh, no, not really. It's not really something that happens. And I was like, oh, it should. I really want it to. I would love to collaborate with more people on the projects that I'm working with, and they don't necessarily have to be within the team that I'm working with. They can be people that are interested in what we're doing as well. So the first thing that we did at Ushahidi is a few of us had a conversation about what we wanted to do within Ushahidi's tool set on open source design. And we actually did a few Open Leaders, Mozilla Open Leaders programs. That's a really great program if you want to check it out. You can do a project supported by Mozilla. And we looked at open source design, and we also looked at other contributions to open source. So we're talking research, user testing, product management, anything that you can think of that wasn't necessarily code. So we looked at open source design and all these other contributions. And this project with Mozilla, the Open Leaders project, that really laid the groundwork for the project that I'm going to go into a lot of detail on, called Open Design within Ushahidi. So after we did this Open Leaders program and we were becoming more vocal about wanting open source design to be promoted and be more active within Ushahidi, we were approached by a global design agency called DesignIt. They have offices all around the world. And we were also approached by Adobe about this as well. So through DesignIt, Adobe were interested in what it meant to contribute as a designer to open source tools, open source software. Now, admittedly, Adobe were really interested in the humanitarian angle as well, because what company doesn't like to say that they're working with an NGO and solving big problems? But they had good intentions around the open source side of things as well. So when we entered into this project with these two partners, they wanted and agreed that whatever we produced from the project should be fully open, should not be tied to Adobe products to use for the contribution, and it also shouldn't be tied to a single open source project. It needs to be a project that could be used by any open source organization, any open source project. And this video that was just rolling, I'll roll it again really quickly. So this was a pilot of an event that we did, one in Berlin and one in Seattle, as part of some conferences that we organized. And we took one of Ushahidi's tools, open source tools, 10.4, which is a crisis communication tool. So it aggregates different communication methods in a crisis, which we created after the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya, which was a terrorist attack on one of the malls there, where we really struggled to get in contact with our staff that were at that mall that weekend. So we created this open source tool to try and solve that problem. What we wanted to do with these pilot events in Berlin and Seattle is really see what happens when you get designers in a room together around a really tricky, challenging tool, a challenging prospect of trying to solve communication within crisis, and introduce them slowly to open source. So a lot of these people that attended these pilot events were your typical designers that, in Abigail's talk earlier on, haven't really got a clue about open source and what it is or what it could be and all the differences that are in open source. But what we discovered from these pilot events is a really fundamental thing to do with how designers engage with open source when they're first engaging. They're looking, as their first engagement, to understand that the open source project does something for good. And Ushahidi's tools were really easy to understand. They really solved a problem that was easy, as in crisis, terrorist attacks, floods, and hurricanes. So designers really were able to, through these nonprofit humanitarian open source tools, start to understand the other ways that other open source tools are for good as well. And start to understand that open source tools are the foundation of the web, the foundation of how we make products, make tools, and by proxy, also how designers work with tools. So you slowly introduce them to the concept of open source through humanitarian open source. But fundamentally, they all want to work on something that contributes their skills for good. It gives them that good feeling, like a lot of us often find with the things that we're really passionate about. So after these pilot events, we thought, right, we've got something that we want to test here and something that we want to improve. So we created the project Open Design within Ushahidi, and we embarked on a 6 to 8 month long research period, as well as planning further events after we've done the research. So what the research was attempting to do within this project was start to understand some of the complex challenges that designers have when they want to start contributing to something, and specifically open source. So we spent a long time doing this research. We spent several months. So we did lots of interviews with open source maintainers. We did interviews with people that are already doing things that are like open source design. We did interviews with non-profit organizations like the UNHCR, UNICEF, that have the World Bank, that have worked with open source tools before. And we also interviewed your regular design community that doesn't already know about open source. And we started to investigate some of these feelings about wanting to feel good about the things that they contribute to and really know what they're actually contributing to, as opposed to some kind of software that does something over here and they're not quite sure. It's maybe Linuxy or Apache, and then we don't quite know what that does, so how can we involve ourselves in it? So we did a lot of this research, and we came to the conclusion that it was still valuable for us to do events as part of this project. So we explored the potential of like a fully remote open source process, but we discovered that designers still need that face time with each other around project creation, a project initiation. So we decided to keep the in-person events and see how we could improve them. And they're designers collaborating and contributing to humanitarian, specific at the time, open source software at Tech for Good challenge gatherings. This is how we presented this to the design community. And the challenges that we found after we did the research period, and the challenges that we tried to address within the iteration of the tools that we've now made open and that we took to events to stress test, are many. So many challenges. I don't have time to go into them all right now, but I've picked out some of the most interesting ones, I think, and the most useful ones to learn from. So let's go into them. So the first one is that design, OSS isn't part of design education. So when we're in formal or informal education, so as we're learning and growing as designers, outside of the open source community, a lot of designers don't, have this exposure to open source. It's really just not part of curriculums. It's not part of how we learn how to do design. We learn other things within our design education. And it's really random, often, how designers stumble across open source design. Maybe it's that they use a tool and they see on the website that it is open source and they get curious and they really want to understand that. Maybe their first time hearing open source, like myself, was when they started working with a commercial development team and they just heard the developers talking about, oh, have you contributed? And they're curious and they go, what do you mean contributed? What's that all about? Tell me more. So it's really unstructured how designers first learn about open source, if at all. And one of the things that we could do to solve that problem is start including it in any kind of education system. So whether it's formal or informal, we want to start including this within education. And connected to education, what we also need to do is within our companies, within the hiring of designers, we need to help those organizations and companies that want to hire designers that have done open source work. We want to help them understand the value of what contributing to open source is. So when a designer takes in their portfolio into an interview and says, I contributed to all these open source projects and this is what I did, that the people hiring don't scratch their heads and go, what do you mean open source? And they go, that's not, something that I've seen before, so I'm not going to rate that highly. So alongside education, we really need to work with our organizations, our hiring companies, to value open source contributions as incredibly vital and valid parts of a designer's portfolio and a designer's career. So the next one is that most open source maintainers, open source projects, when you say the word design to them, they're like, I need a logo. Or they go, our UI is not great and we don't like material design and we hate doing our UI development. And they talk about design in very visual terms. And that's, again, a gap in education from the development side of things. So I don't get cross or mad at developers that don't understand the complexities of design because we have our own community language, our own community culture as well in design. But design can offer so much more value than logos, icons, UI, and graphics. There's a whole background of user experience design where you really in-depth understand your users as designers. You do interviews, you extrapolate and take all of the learnings that a user would give you and you communicate that and form that into a series of actions that they would do on a product. And that's a really vital, valuable, and complex process for designers to go to, and it could be so amazing for open source. There's plenty of other things that designers do as well, so we don't have time to list them now. So the next thing is something that I went into in my workshop on Thursday, was that open source projects, when they write their own issues, no matter how kind of user-friendly they make their issues, maybe you are writing issues like, as a user, I want to do this, this, and this, even that doesn't really speak to a designer in the ways in which they want to approach problem solving. So OSS project issues and the way that they're written can be restrictive, even if they're making an effort to making them inclusive for designers. But most of the time I go into open source repos and I see something deeply complex in developer language that I have to translate, possibly ask for support in translating, so before I can even attempt to help that issue. And sometimes you might think that issues are just a development issue, but there's always support and always insight that designers can offer. I was recently talking about how work in the terminal can benefit from user experience design, like how you see a series of different functions and commands and prompts within the terminal. And I also helped within Ushahidi with an installer helper and looked at the user experience of an API installer. So there's so many ways that designers can help. But the flip side of that is when you have really open issues, really open, oh, we have a problem with, people coming to our project and logging in. Sometimes that is too open for designers, and they'll create something which is called design fiction, and they might end up creating a contribution which could never be developed. So you're looking at some of the pilot events that we did. Some of the designers approached the challenge in this design fiction way, where they mocked up ideas that involved AR and VR and technologies around mobile signals chaining between devices that did not currently exist, so could not be implemented by any development team, let alone an open source small organization development team. So one of the things that is challenging about writing your issues that you want design help on is that balance between implementable and accessible to designers. And the next one, some things are happening in version control for design, which is super cool, but really there's not great version control within design at the moment. So the way that a lot of designers do version control, if they don't even know that, a lot of designers don't really even know what version control is, so you have to explain that to them first. They do it through communication, essentially, and comments on design work. And you really have to share files a lot more. It's a lot more difficult to share files than it is necessarily to pull down and push certain parts of code and see the conflicting lines of code that you do when you contribute development work. So version control is a really tricky thing within design. And this is especially a problem when we look at doing design contribution across time zones, across languages, across countries, which is also super vital to be able to do this. We need to fix the problem of version control in design. So to go into how we did the open design project now. So to move away from the challenges that we had and what the things that we wanted to tackle and try and solve within these events. So we did 2 events where we piloted our solutions to the challenges that we discovered and our framework for working with design communities on open source challenges, open source tools. And we did one in Bangalore in India, and we focused on the Kerala floods that happened there in 2018 and 2019. So they had mass flooding in the southwest of India during that time. And we did one in Taipei in Taiwan that was focused on hurricanes and typhoons, but specifically the effect that it had on rural farmers and how it absolutely devastated their lives when there was typhoons and hurricanes in that area. So we wanted to focus on the 10.4 communication tool, the open source tool, engaging designers with a specific challenge around these crisis events. And what we did within the workshops is we did a series of introductions to the tooling, we did a series of introductions to the project, some team building work, and then we launched into the design activities. Now, I went through a few of these design activities in my Thursday workshop, but these design activities are some of the things that most designers will learn how to do within their career, but they're also things that are super accessible for anyone to participate in. So things like empathy maps, if you don't already know what an empathy map is, take a look online and find some resources, or I can give you some templates. But it's how you engage with your users and the emotions of your users to solve their problems. So designers were actively working on empathy maps for the open source tool 10.4, around these issues of flooding and hurricanes. They also did defining the problems, ideation, storyboarding, and then they went into prototyping. So I want to focus a little bit on how am I doing for time? All good? Okay. Okay, cool. So I want to focus a little bit on what's really important when you want to organize potentially your own open design related workshop in a specific location. So some of the things that we learned were really important when you're organizing these events for designers working on open source. So the first one was around location. So I touched on that a little bit earlier on. So location is really, really important. So the reason that we chose flooding and the reason that we chose hurricanes, because there are many things within the 10.4 open source tool that could be improved, but it was because we were going to those places, engaging with the design community and the open source community there. The purpose of why they were there and why they were solving the problems needed to be directly relevant to their location. It needed to be something that if the designers hadn't experienced themselves, that they knew about within their local communities. And it was relevant and they cared about it. So if you remember back at the beginning that designers want to contribute to something for good, it makes it extra important when it's something that's close to home, close to something that they've experienced or their immediate circle has experienced. And also you kind of form these new communities of designers, which is super cool, and open source has a lot of need for building community, as we've heard a lot today. And the second thing that's really important about these events is actually essential. I would never recommend that you do an event without this. You need at least one person that is affected by what you're building. So we had witnesses. We called them witnesses rather than users. Users is a little bit of a kind of gross term, so it kind of dehumanizes people a little bit. So we had witnesses. So this is Akila M, and she works for the, let me get this right, the Center of International Migration and Development in Southwest India. And she was living in the southwest of India as the floods were happening. She was doing research around that area, and she was reporting on what was happening. And she had direct experience of the floods and what was happening during the floods. What she didn't have experience of was open source and design, but what she was there to do was answer the designers' questions of, we think we should build this, but did that actually happen when you were there? And she could go, oh, that sounds great, but also consider this. And she was there to validate and make what the designers were creating relevant to that location and to that situation and better for that issue. In Taipei, we had Mei Mei and Hong Wen, and they were a farmer, a rural farmer, that had a farm that was devastated by a typhoon. So he had direct experience of this disaster. And Mei Mei was an office worker in the city that organized volunteers to go and help the farmers. So again, they were there for the designers to answer questions and make the designs that they were creating relevant to the issue and relevant to that purpose. And as I said earlier on, translating issues, so when you just go in with an issue straight from your repo and say, hey, work with this, it takes much longer for the designers to really work with that material. They have to translate it themselves. So if you can do the work, and there's, again, templates throughout the open design project for you to translate issues into what we call design challenges. If you can do that work, you're helping the designers get to solving the problem quicker. And the thing that we wanted to make sure was the output of these workshops. So we wanted tangible outputs for the open source projects, 10.4 in this instance, there was clickable prototypes by every team that participated in the design workshops. So we had 5 or 6 teams per event, per workshop, and each of those teams picked an individual challenge that was different from the others, and they created clickable prototypes using sticker sheets and templates and design systems that we provided for them within the workshop. And they were able to have a clear output that gave them a great feeling at the end, like, yes, I've contributed something. I've made my first contribution, and it's tangible in design. And also, the open source project then had prototypes to work on. So the aim of the open design project are these: that to increase and sustain contribution from designers, to support the design community, both already in open source and the regular design community that doesn't know about open source yet, and to build this understanding between design and open source and development, and help that process be smoother and help educate. And bringing open design to education institutes and workplaces. So we want to now, outside of the pilot of Ushahidi's tools, work with more open source projects. If you work on open source projects, please come and talk to me about your open source projects. If you think that design workshops and design contributions would be good for them, chances are they will be, then please come and talk to me. We can organize a workshop for these open source projects. And we want to do things more globally. We want to make sure that this work, this open source community, doesn't stay isolated in these locations, that you get to connect with designers from Taipei, designers from Bangalore, designers from the UK, the US, and here in Lagos, in Nigeria, where all of you can learn from each other's design experience. And so to find the tools, the open tools that you can use and remix and however you want, they're completely open source. This is the repo, the GitHub/Ushahidi/open design. Everything is on there, including all of our research. We even documented every conversation that we had down to a lot of minute detail, so everything is there. Please fork this and use it. And the last thing that I would say is that we have an existing community of open source designers already. We have the opensourcedesign.net community, where there's an amazing forum there, where when you're doing your first contributions, maybe as a solo designer before these workshops are happening, there's a community there to support you within those first design contributions. And as an open source project, there's a place on the forum where you can post, hey, we need help with this in our open source. So you can post that in the jobs section of the open source design forum, and you get designers commenting, contributing, and wanting to help you on those things. And that's me, finished. Thank you very much.
Woo!